Hey guys, in this episode we're going to be talking about adding aftermarket gauges to your car. So we're going to be talking about different styles of aftermarket gauges, different ways of mounting them, and sort of why you want to add them to your performance vehicle. So the first thing, we're going to talk about two different types of gauges. We're going to talk about temperature gauges and pressure gauges. We're not going to get into boost gauges and things like that, but there's a few different diagnostics readings that you want to have on your performance vehicle to make sure everything's running right, to make sure you're not going to blow up your car. And that is water coolant temperature, oil temperature, and oil pressure. So we have different sensors. When we buy our gauges, this actually will come with the gauge. And the first one here is a temperature sensor. So this is actually one pulled off a Toyota engine for a GE engine. And basically what it is a thermistor. So it's a resistor which changes its resistance with temperature. And so this is just a brass fitting with that resistor inside. And this goes into the coolant line somewhere in the car, somewhere in that coolant line, and it registers the temperature. And that gives a digital reading to your gauge telling you, okay, this is the temperature. So where we place this temperature measurement sensor is important, because if we place it before or after the radiator, it's going to be a different temperature. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So this can be for water coolant temperature as well as oil temperature. And we'll show you how to mount oil gauges as well. Oil sensor measurements. So the next one is a pressure sensor. And this is a pressure sensor device. It's quite large. It looks similar to the sort of OEM ones that you have already on your car. Different styles are used in different engines. I've already made a video talking about the difference between a 16 valve and a 20 valve pressure sensor for the Toyota 4AG engine. But this is one that came with an aftermarket gauge. And so this will screw into our oil filter adapter sandwich plate, which we'll show in a second here. And it has a little hole in the end which measures the pressure. There's a diaphragm in here which registers the pressure difference between a fixed pressure inside this unit and the pressure pushing on the end through this hole. So this is going to be used for oil pressure measurements. Now, when we have our gauges, we'll show some gauges in the car. How do we mount them? We're going to put them somewhere on our dash or somewhere in the interior of the car. There's different options. Because I have three gauges that I'm adding, oil temperature, oil pressure, and water temperature, I found that this sort of nice 3-unit was the cheapest and the most effective way of mounting them, because they're all contained in one nice unit which I can mount and look at all the readings together at once. The other option, of course, is to go with single gauge holders, which are mounted on a little base, and they can swivel. And we can put these, anywhere on our dash. If we're just going to be adding 1 or 2 gauges, we don't need this big, large 3-row. We can just add them separately with these single gauges. Now, the other popular one is a gauge pillar pod. That's on the A arm of your windshield. It's a popular area to put gauges. I don't have one here to show you guys, but I'm sure you can find pictures online. Very popular locations. So now that we talked about the different types of sensors, the different types of ways of mounting them, let's actually go show you my application of these gauges and sensors, and sort of what I had to do to install them and what I had to do to get everything working properly. Let's go ahead and do that now. So first off, this is a Toyota 4AGE engine in a Toyota MR2, and this engine is located in the rear, so it might look a little bit funny to guys with the front engine design, but this engine already has temperature sensors and pressure sensors for the oil. We can see here, this is the OEM coolant temperature sensor, and this goes to the little gauge that I'm going to show you on the dash, This one doesn't actually give you a digital reading, like a number, it just gives you a little movable gauge. And so we have that already, we can compare that to. This one is measuring the coolant temperature in the actual block of the engine. So that's one measurement reading we're going to have. And we also have a pressure sensor located on the block itself for the oil. It's a little bit hard to show you here with the engine installed, but I might have a picture that I can show now. And so now, where do we add our aftermarket temperature sensors and pressure sensors? Well, if we look at the exhaust side of the engine, and we zoom in here, you can see here that silver connector between the blue and black rubber coolant hoses. And this is the coolant line exiting the engine. So we have the coolant coming from the engine, entering from the blue, and exiting to the black rubber hose going to the front radiator. Again, this is a mid-engine design car, so the radiator is in the front. So it's quite a large coolant path. And that silver adapter, that's where the sensor is screwed into, so you can actually see two wires. The middle one is the sensor, that's the sensor signal, and the left little one is the ground for the sensor. So we need to get this adapter plate for the coolant line to mount that sensor, and then we have to run two wires to our gauges, which measures the coolant temperature. So the neat thing about this is that when I run my car, I have the coolant temperature sensor from the engine going to my OEM dash, which tells me the temperature in the engine block. Now when the engine's warming up from it's cold, I started in the morning, I can start to see that gauge going up, but this coolant temperature sensor, the aftermarket one, won't even budge. And that's because the thermostat hasn't opened yet. When that aftermarket gauge starts to go up, I know that the thermostat has opened and the coolant line has been opened to the radiator and the engine is fully warm. I added the temperature sensor before the radiator because I wanted a measurement of the coolant temperature before it's cooled by the radiator. That's the more important measurement. If it starts to get too hot, then I know I'm in trouble. So, the oil temperature and oil pressure sensors are mounted to an oil filter sandwich plate, which is located just underneath the exhaust manifold. It's a little bit difficult to show here when the engine's in the car, but let me see if I can have a picture here. And what we can see is that we have two sensors, the pressure and the temperature. Now let's go take a look at the front of the car with the gauges. So this is the inside of the car, and as I said before, I have my OEM measurements. The lower one is the coolant temperature, and that's that temperature sensor that I showed in the engine block itself. And then the upper one is a oil sensor, and this is oil pressure. So we have an oil pressure OEM sensor screwed into the block itself, and that gives me a somewhat sort of reading there. Again, these are not numerical values, but they're just a good indication of if your engine is healthy. Now, in contrast, we have the aftermarket gauges. Now, these aren't particularly expensive gauges. I bought them on eBay. They're about $15 each for the whole kit, the sensor and the gauge. Again, I mounted these three together in this nice pod and mounted it on top of my center console. I have water temperature, oil temperature, and oil pressure. Like I said before, you have to mount this and you have to run the wires to each of those sensors. So because the sensors are in the back of the car, the wires run through the dash, underneath the center armrest, and then out the back firewall into the engine bay. You also need to supply power to these gauges so that they turn on. I've wired them to a switch down here. You can see it, GAG for gauges. And when we have the engine on, we can get those sensors turned on by flicking this switch. So let's go ahead and go get my keys, and we can turn these gauges on and take a look, what they look like. So we have the key in the ignition set to accessory, and now we are able to flick this switch on and turn on the gauges. So because the engine is off, the oil pressure is very low. We have a warning light. Obviously, because the oil pressure is so low, the engine's not even running. And the oil temperature and water temperature are set 40 degrees Celsius. They're probably a cooler than this. The temperature is probably around 26 today. The default settings for this seem to be 40 for these cheaper gauges. Not too worried about that. When I'm running the car, they seem to be running about sort of 80, 90 for the oil temperature and about 70 to 80 degrees Celsius for the water temperature. Seems alright. Again, I'm not too worried about the actual values, just the trends. So, if my oil pressure is dropping, I know I have an oil leak. If it's too high, I know something's going on. There might be a block in my oil passages. If my oil temperature is skyrocketing, that might be an indication that I have, oil degradation and might, spin a bearing or something. And if my water temperature is going up, I'm gonna, overheat my engine and cause damage. So these are just a nice way of keeping tabs on your engine internals. So, I already have my OEM gauges that can tell me some stuff, but it's nice to have these other ones, which are mounted in different locations, to give you different measurements and more diagnostic information to make sure that your engine doesn't blow up. Especially when you do an engine swap or you're doing a lot of work yourself, you want to double check your work, and these gauges are really great way of double checking, all your work. So, fairly cheap gauges you can buy. You can buy more expensive ones if you'd like. It comes with everything you need, except for a few little things. The oil temperature and oil pressure need an oil filter sandwich adapter plate. I have a picture of that here. And the water temperature needs that adapter piece. They come in different sizes for different hose diameters, and you need that adapter piece so you have an area to screw in that temperature sensor. You mount it, you wire them up, you wire them to a switch if you'd like, and you're good to go. So, good luck.